Lecture 17, Menander and Hellenistic Literature.
Welcome back to Lecture 17. This lecture has two main objectives. First, to talk about New Comedy and the work of the playwright Menander, and second, to talk about the Hellenistic age of Greek culture and Hellenistic literature in general, and there we'll focus on the works of the poet Callimachus. So to start with Menander and New Comedy is the last remaining form of Athenian drama that we have to discuss in this course. It flourished from the late 4th through the 3rd centuries BC, and we know the names of more than 80 writers of New Comedy who were active in Athens between 325 and 200 BC. However, we have only one complete play of New Comedy, the Dyskolos, or Grouch, or Grumpy Old Man, as it can be translated, of Menander. Menander was born probably around 344 and died around 292 BC. He wrote nearly 100 plays himself. He staged his first one in 321, but he won only 8 victories. So he was not extremely successful during his lifetime, but after his death, Menander's works became extremely popular. However, by the 8th century AD, all his plays were lost, and until the 20th century, our knowledge of Menander's plays, and thus really of New Comedy itself, depended on only a very few fragments and also primarily on the adaptations of Menander's works and the works of other New Comic poets by the Roman comedians Terence and Plautus. So the rediscovery of Menander, of some of Menander's actual works, is one of the great success stories of 20th century classical scholarship, both literary and archaeological. In 1907, significant segments of 3 of Menander's plays, The Arbitrance, The Girl Who Had Her Hair Cut, and The Samian Woman, were published from a manuscript found in Egypt. The total amount of text of these plays was about 1,600 lines. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot for 3 plays, but before this, these 3 plays had been known from only a very few scanty quotations amounting to about 20 lines of text total for all 3 of them combined. So to go from 20 lines to 1,600 lines was a very significant jump in our understanding of these plays. Even more importantly, the all but complete text of Dyskolos, the Grouch, was discovered in Egypt in 1957 and published in 1959, and the manuscript that contained Dyskolos also contained large sections of 2 other plays. Since then, substantial fragments of several other of Menander's works have come to light, and the result is that we now have one almost complete play of Menander's. Dyskolos is slightly damaged, but it's pretty much all there, and enough of several others to have a fairly good understanding of their plots and their style. These discoveries have tended to confirm what scholars already thought they knew about the nature of New Comedy. It's always nice when our theories turn out to be right. Scholars had thought from the fragments that we have and from Plautus and Terence that we knew pretty well how New Comedy worked, and these discoveries of Menander's works have tended to confirm those earlier theories, both about New Comedy and about its differences from Old and Middle Comedy. And there's good reason to hope for more to come. Menander was clearly very popular in Egypt, and Egypt, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, is a very rich source for papyrus, both fragments and whole papyruses, because the climate is so conducive to preserving papyrus. So as archaeological excavations go on, we may discover more plays by Menander. Now, what these plays show us is that New Comedy was substantially different from Old Comedy, particularly in its subject matter. The plots of New Comedy tend to revolve around personal relationships, misunderstandings, problems between members of a family, and reconciliations effected largely through chance. Many of Menander's plots involve star-crossed lovers, to use a much later term. The plot often revolves around a freeborn young man who falls in love with a woman he cannot marry, a girl he cannot marry because of her social status. She's either a slave or of much, much lower status than he is. And the resolution comes about through the discovery that the young woman is in fact freeborn, and thus the two can actually marry. So that's the kind of difficulty and resolution caused often by chance, a chance discovery of who this girl actually is. Now, a variation on this plot device that is repeated in Roman adaptations and that modern audiences find deeply disturbing is that a young man discovers that his newly married wife is the same woman he had previously raped. This is an area where the cultural difference between our society and the society that at least considers new comedy amusing, whether this reflects any societal realities or not, they at least found this an amusing plot. And here is where we can see the distance between our societal assumptions and theirs perhaps the most clearly. For one thing, the use of rape as a plot device with really no opprobrium against the rapist reflects, for one thing, an entirely male viewpoint of audience and playwright alike, I think. The girl's trauma is not considered at all. The rape is a plot device whereby the young man, usually at a religious festival at night, forces himself on a girl he doesn't know. A few months later, he gets married. He discovers his new wife is pregnant. She's too pregnant to have conceived after the marriage. He's about to repudiate her, and then, lo and behold, it turns out that she was the girl he raped at that festival, so happy ending, right? Now, as I say, this is very disturbing to us, but one of the cultural impetuses for this plot is that in the assumptions of ancient Greek society, a young girl could not allow herself to be seduced and remain admirable or remain a good character. So if you want to have the discovery that the wife the man thinks is adulterous is actually completely blameless, rape comes into the picture as a plot device in that regard. Another favorite topos in New Comedy is that of the lost or misidentified child. Specifically, there are plots in which a girl who was kidnapped as a baby is restored to her rightful parents after spending her early years as a slave. And clearly, this can facilitate the star-crossed lovers type of plot. A young man falls in love with a slave girl. They can't marry. Then he discovers that she's actually the kidnapped daughter of a family of his same social status. They end up marrying. In general, Menander's plots are driven by tensions, difficulties, and misunderstandings between individuals, parent and child, husband and wife, master and slave, and their resolutions. And with this overview of the typical plots of New Comedy, we can see some of its most important differences from Old Comedy. Unlike Old Comedy, New Comedy was almost entirely apolitical. It was written for performance in Athens, and the plays are usually set in some area in or around or near Athens, but they're by no means, through their plots, tied to any particular time or any particular place. They could be anywhere. There are almost no overt political references in New Comedy. So in that regard, it's very different indeed from Old Comedy. Mockery of named individuals is entirely absent. The characters instead are stock everyman type characters. They're entirely fictional. And they are often stock characters of the type the young lover, the grumpy old man, the ingenue, the clever slave, that kind of recognizable character, so you know almost where you are with the characters before you get into the individual plot. New Comedy's plots rely heavily on coincidence and chance to bring about their happy endings, but the fantastic element of Old Comedy is entirely lacking. While chance and luck certainly play important roles in New Comedy, there aren't any talking animals or flying dung beetles or choruses of clouds, no visits to Cloud Cuckoo Land or the underworld, none of those things that we saw in Old Comedy. Instead, the plots are firmly set within the everyday world. The events may be unusual. It's not a very common thing to discover that your long-lost kidnapped daughter has been brought up as a slave in the house next door, for instance. The events may be unusual, but their context is not. And in this regard, I think it would hardly be an exaggeration to say that New Comedies are the ancestors of our modern situation comedies, since the plots are concerned with fairly average everyday characters and the situations in which they find themselves. One could also argue that Menander's works are the ultimate ancestors of realistic novels, put realistic in quotation marks there, but novels which stress personal relationships, and in particular novels which stress love and marriage, which go through a series of misunderstandings between the not yet betrothed couple, and the happy ending consists in their marriage. I'm thinking in particular of the works, for instance, of Jane Austen, which you'll study later on in the course with Professor Heffernan. They in many ways follow the same kind of pattern as Menander's New Comedies. New Comedy also is very different from Old Comedy in its form and in its style. There's no fixed structure of agon and parabasis. We saw how that was already disappearing in Middle Comedy. The chorus is almost completely gone. In New Comedy, the chorus's only role is to divide the acts, so to speak, by musical interludes. In fact, there are some manuscripts in which the word chorus is just written in with no words provided for it. It no longer matters what they sing. They're just a between-act musical entertainment. So that's a great difference from Old Comedy. While the plots of New Comedy are humorous, they are funny, they don't feature the bawdy or raucous jokes of Old Comedy. And the language itself, interestingly, gives the impression of everyday colloquial speech. I say the impression because this is still poetry. These works are still written in meter, so they're not the way that people actually talk, but they give the impression the language is simple and straightforward sounding, despite the fact that it's metrical. Now, Discalus, the one complete play by Menander that has survived, or rather that has been resurrected in the 20th century, illustrates many of these elements of New Comedy in its plot and in its structure. The basic plot of Discalus involves potentially thwarted young love. In this case, the young lovers are potentially thwarted because of the misanthropic nature of the girl's father, the grouch or grumpy old man of the play's title. The prologue of the play is spoken by the god Pan. He takes no direct part in the action after the prologue, but he speaks the prologue, gives us essential background information. Pan, of course, is that half-goat, half-man god who is in effect the god of the countryside, of nature, of the natural world. And Pan tells us in the prologue to the play, that the plot will involve families living on two adjacent farms. So it's in the countryside near Athens, and it deals with two families on two adjacent farms. On the right, Pan says, is the farm of Cnemon, the grumpy old man, who lives alone with his daughter Myrine. After Myrine's birth, life with Cnemon had become utterly intolerable for his wife. He had married her when she was a widow with a son. After their daughter was born, Cnemon's wife left him, moved onto the farm next door, and that's where she now lives with her grown son, Gorgias. Now, Pan tells us that Myrine, who's old enough now to be of marriageable age, so say around 14, 15, something like that, is a very good girl who deserves a better life than she's likely to have with her horrible old father. And Pan has, therefore, caused a rich young man named Sostratus to fall in love with Myrine. So after setting up the situation for us, Pan exits, and Sostratus and his friend Kyrios enter, talking about Sostratus's troubles, about the fact that he's in love with Myrine, but can't marry her. In fact, he can't even talk to her. He's been thwarted in all his attempts to court her by Cnemon's threats of violence. The old grouch chases any and all callers away from his door. He doesn't care what they're there for. If you come to try to talk to him or his daughter, he chases you away and threatens you with violence. Now, Sostratus tells Gorgias, Myrine's stepbrother, or half-brother rather, that he wants to marry Myrine, and Gorgias agrees to help. After some intricate convolutions of the plot, I'm summarizing very briefly here, Cnemon falls into a well. That's where chance comes into it, because Gorgias and Sostratus rescue him from the well he's fallen into. And so, because of this chance occurrence, they have the opportunity to rescue Cnemon from the well. He is so grateful that he formally adopts Gorgias, his wife's son from a previous marriage. He formally adopts Gorgias as his son and gives Gorgias the privilege of picking a husband for Myrine. Says, now that you're my fully adopted son, you can decide whom your little sister gets to marry. And Gorgias, of course, picks Sostratus. So happy ending for that couple. Just to round things out, Sostratus persuades his own father to allow Sostratus' sister to marry Gorgias. So we have a double wedding, everybody's happy, everything ends well for all concerned. That is a typical new comedy type of plot. You can see the elements I was talking about there. These are average, everyday people. They're not flying up to Olympus on a dung beetle. They're not going down to the underworld. They're not talking to birds or frogs or wasps. They are average, everyday people. The comedy consists in their working through a convoluted situation of difficulties, misunderstandings, personality conflicts. And it's funny. It's very humorously done. It comes to a resolution in a happy ending, and a happy ending that in particular revolves around marriage, in this case, a double marriage. Now, at this point, I want to move to the second main focus of this lecture and talk a bit about the Hellenistic age of Greek literature. Menander's working life corresponds almost exactly with the beginning of what we call the Hellenistic age. The Hellenistic age is the term generally applied to the time period from the death of Alexander the Great, that is from 323 BC, to the Battle of Actium, which I'll explain in just a minute or two, in 31 BC. So the standard dates of the Hellenistic age are 323 through 31 BC. Hellenistic in this context means Greek-influenced or Greek-dominated. In the 5th century, you'll remember from the lectures on Herodotus and Thucydides, in the 5th century, the power struggles between Athens and Sparta focused on their hegemony over other, at least originally independent Greek city-states. So the power struggles in the 5th century were Greek city-states trying to dominate other Greek city-states. But in 338, that is late in the 4th century, Philip of Macedon, after prolonged campaigns, won the Battle of Chaeronea, which effectively ended the era of independent Greek city-states, and Philip gained dominance over all of Greece. His son, Alexander the Great, so-called, ruled from 336 to 323 BC, and Alexander expanded his empire from what his father Philip had left him to include a vast stretch of territory that stretched from Egypt in the south all the way to the borders of India in the east, an absolutely phenomenally large territory to be controlled by one ruler, one king, one emperor in the ancient world. Now, Alexander died in 323 BC, and when he died, his empire was divided into several kingdoms, which we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. Each one of those kingdoms was led by a man who had been one of Alexander's generals. There was no way Alexander could administer his vast empire by himself, particularly with communications being what they were in the ancient world. And so he had appointed trusted generals to be, in effect, his viceroys, his rulers, his subsidiary rulers over different areas of his empire. When he died, unexpectedly and at a very early age, each of these generals basically set himself up as king and became the founder of a hereditary dynasty. These are what we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Seleucid dynasty took control of Asia Minor and the Near East. The Antigonid dynasty ruled Macedonia. Most importantly for our purposes in this lecture and in the rest of this course, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. Alexander's general who was in control of Egypt when Alexander died was named Ptolemy, and he founded a dynasty that continued to rule over Egypt. In Ptolemaic Egypt, in the Hellenistic age, Alexandria was the most important city. Alexandria obviously named after Alexander himself. Now, Greek continued to be the common spoken language, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and Greek cultural norms were reproduced in Hellenistic kingdoms. So these generals of Alexander's carried Greek culture and Greek cultural norms with them, and particularly in Egypt, this was important because Alexandria became, in effect, the cultural capital of the Greek-speaking world. You have to think of the center of Greek civilization, Greek literary production, Greek culture moving from Athens down into Egypt. So the center of Greek culture in the Hellenistic world is no longer Athens, it's Alexandria in Egypt. There was a second flowering of Greek literature perhaps comparable to what had happened in Athens in the 5th century BC, and a development, an astonishing development of scholarship, of the methods and procedures of scholarship in Alexandria during the Hellenistic age. The Hellenistic age came to an end with the fall of the last member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last Ptolemy, Cleopatra, who was defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Interestingly enough, Cleopatra was the first of her family, the first Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, to bother to learn to speak Egyptian. These people were ethnically Greek. They ruled over the Egyptians, but between 323, when Alexander died, all the way down to Cleopatra's lifetime, and again, she was defeated in 31 BC, Cleopatra was the first Ptolemy who bothered to learn to speak the language of the people she was ruling. Now, as with any such age or historical period, these dates are obviously arbitrary to some degree. Nobody woke up in 323 and said, well, that's it, the classical age is over, now we're in the Hellenistic age. And similarly, they didn't say Battle of Actium, okay, that's it, the Hellenistic age is over. But the reason we use those dates as boundaries is because Alexander's death definitely marked the beginning of a new political and cultural era, the fragmentation of his empire into the Hellenistic kingdoms and Greek cultural ascendancy in those kingdoms. And so also the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC marked a transition from the importance of the Hellenistic kingdoms to the hegemony of Rome, or some scholars in the Hellenistic age in 30 BC with Cleopatra's actual death by suicide. We'll talk more about the Battle of Actium and its importance for Roman culture in a later lecture. But right now I want to look at Alexandria's cultural and literary importance. As the intellectual center of the Hellenistic Greek age, of Hellenistic Greek culture, Alexandria was noteworthy for its museum and for its library, both of which were founded during the reign of Ptolemy I, and so by the end of the 4th century BC. Alexandria was also famous and important for the scholars and authors who worked at the museum and the library. Museum, or museion in Greek, means place for the muses. It doesn't in this context mean building that holds artifacts, that holds artwork or anthropological artifacts or anything else. It means place for the muses. And the Alexandrian Museum was a center of scholarship, of learning, and of philology, the study of language, the study of literature. Perhaps the closest modern equivalent would be a research foundation associated with a great university. The museum's importance for the history of Western literature, well, for Western culture in general, but for Western literature, is absolutely incalculable. A.W. Bullock puts it this way. He says that the museum was, quote, perhaps the most important institution in the history of Europe for the transmission of Western culture. Had the Alexandrian Museum not been founded when it was, Horace, that's a Roman lyric poet, would probably be the nearest that a modern reader could come to Greek lyric poetry, and we might be reduced to reconstructing Sophocles from Seneca, close quote. Now, remember in the very first introductory lecture, when I was grappling with defining Western in the Western literary tradition, I said we can't really say European because some of the authors we'll be talking about lived outside Europe, though they were definitely members of the Western literary and cultural tradition. Here you have that same idea when Bullock says that the Museum of Alexandria in Egypt was perhaps the most important institution in the history of Europe. So the cultural boundaries do not necessarily line up with the geographical boundaries, ever, I suppose. Throughout this course, I've talked about Alexandrian scholars doing this, Alexandrian scholars doing that. These are the scholars that I was talking about. The great library of Alexandria was associated with the museum, and during the early years of the museum and the library, a great deal of attention was paid to assembling texts of all known Greek authors. That was the task they set themselves when they founded the library, to set out to try to get copies of every work written by every Greek author. An unprecedented undertaking and an enormously and extremely difficult one. The library, in fact, preserved Greek literature. Now, we have much less of Greek literature than we would like to have, but we would have so very much less of it still had it not been for the library. So the library preserved Greek literature, and Equally importantly, the librarians, the heads of the library, and other scholars working there developed techniques of scholarship that we still use to some extent today and that began the critical and scholarly understanding of the works of Greek literature. So they didn't just gather these works, put them on the shelf, and ignore them. They invented methods of editorial work, of scholarship, of commentary, of comparing different texts to decide which reading was best, and so forth. Among the innovations of Alexandrian scholarship, I can just give you really one example, but among the innovations of Alexandrian scholarship that was crucially important was the division of Homer's epics into 24 regularized books each. I've referred over and over again in previous lectures to an ancient work being 24 books long or 9 books long, and I've usually told you that what I mean by that is it took 24 average-sized papyrus scrolls or 9 papyrus scrolls to write the work out. Well, the Iliad and the Odyssey are both long enough that they take about 24 scrolls to write out. Up until the Alexandrian scholars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, whoever copied the Iliad, whenever a scribe set out to copy the Iliad, he would just write to the end of his first scroll and then start writing on the second scroll. So if he broke off in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a scene, no matter. He just kept writing, and it took usually about 24 scrolls to write the whole Iliad or the whole Odyssey out. The great innovation of the Alexandrian scholars was to realize that if we regularized this, if we said scroll number 1 will always end at this point, scroll number 2 will always begin at this point, suddenly we have a way of referring to specific passages in the text. Do you see what I mean? Instead of saying, do you remember that part about 3 hours into the Iliad where Priam and Helen sit on the wall of Troy and she tells him who the fighters below are? You can say, do you remember in book 3, lines 161 through 170? And so they invented, in effect, the possibility of citation, the possibility of saying book 3, line 161, book 12, line 65. That can only be done if every time book 1 is copied, it stops in the same place. And somebody had to think of that, first off. This was one of the Alexandrians' contributions. The museum and the library not only fostered scholarship, they also fostered creativity. In particular, the Hellenistic age was a time of great poetic output. And one of the most important Hellenistic scholar poets, someone who was both a great scholar and a great poet, was Callimachus, who hit his high point, his floruit, as we say, around 285 through 270 BC. Callimachus was astonishingly prolific, both in scholarly work and in poetry. His works of scholarship included the catalog of the Library of Alexandria. There's another marvelous innovation in scholarship, not just putting all the books on the shelves, but coming up with a system so they could be found. He cataloged the Library of Alexandria. He did a scholarly edition of Pindar and a bibliography of Greek literature. That's on the scholarly side. On the creative side, he was also a great poet in his own right. More than 800 books total are attributed to Callimachus, but all are lost apart from 6 hymns and around 60 epigrams and a few scattered fragments here and there. We know he was of the utmost importance. We have very little left of his work. We can tell that in many ways his most important work was a book called the Aetia, or the Origins. That was a collection in 4 books, that is 4 papyrus scrolls, of short poems. They perhaps totaled 4,000 lines in all. In the Aetia, Callimachus champions short, elusive, learned poetry rather than long narrative poems. In other words, he sets his own poetic style, his own poetic credo, in direct opposition to epic. He says that Apollo, the god of poetry and song, favors a slender muse. The idea is that the muse of poetry has gotten bloated, she's overweight, she's fat. Apollo would prefer her to be slender. What we need is short, self-contained, slender poems rather than long, overblown epic ones. And Callimachus's approach to poetry not only favored short poems, but also, as I already said, extremely learned, extremely elusive, extremely scholarly poems. Poetry written, in other words, not to be enjoyed by the masses, but to be understood by the scholars who could recognize the allusions, who could recognize the references to other arcane poetry. And in this regard, Callimachus's approach to poetry was to have absolutely enormous influence on Roman poets, in particular on Roman lyric poets such as Catullus, to whom we will turn in the next lecture.